Alfred the Great died on Friday the 26th of October, 899, at the age of 50 or 51. He had been king of Wessex for 28 years and king of the Anglo-Saxons for 3 years before his death. While kings and nations around him had crumbled under Viking invasion, Alfred, the youngest of 5 sons and who never expected to be king, managed to completely transform the land he lived in and laid the groundwork for what would become a united England. And yet, Alfred, one of only 2 kings in English history to ever be called great, who was buried in great pomp and reverence, has no tomb for us to remember him by. The journey and mystery of what happened to his remains spans over 1,000 years. He was originally buried in the old Minster church in Winchester, the place he made his capital. Before he died, Alfred had already arranged for the construction of a new structure that would house a mausoleum for him and eventually his entire family. When the great new Minster church was consecrated 4 years later, Alfred and his wife Elswith's remains were moved. They were placed next to the altar, and for 211 years, there he remained. For a time, the new Minster church in Winchester was the largest church in Europe. But when William the Conqueror conquered England, Alfred's capital of Winchester began being stripped of its Anglo-Saxon footprint. William had the royal palace rebuilt and added a new castle. He put one of his relatives in as Bishop of Winchester, and the decision was made to tear down both the old and new Minster churches and replace them with a grand and massive Norman cathedral. In 1093, just slightly to the south of where the old and new Minster churches had been, the new cathedral was consecrated. By 1110, the new Minster church's monks were moved to a place called Hyde Abbey, a mile away. Before the new Minster church was completely destroyed, the bodies were exhumed, and a great procession took the bones of Alfred, Elswith, and Edward to be laid to rest before the high altar at Hyde Abbey. This would not even remotely be the end of the story of Alfred's bones. In 1539, Hyde Abbey was closed and was one of the many casualties of Henry VIII's dissolution of monasteries in England. Everything of value was stripped and taken out of the abbey, and the building began being disassembled, and the site was used as a stone quarry. Eventually, a large, stately home was placed on the site, and parts of the land were used for grazing. It may seem impossible that the tomb of a king as celebrated and admired as Alfred the Great would be lost, but somehow it was. Over the next 200 years, the tombs were covered with rubble and forgotten. In 1788, the land where Hyde Abbey had been was taken over by the county, and a jail was placed there. The prisoners of the jail were given the task to clear the rubble and dig the foundations for construction. As they did, they began finding graves beneath the ground. Graves including a great stone coffin near where the high altar would have been. Was this the tomb of Alfred the Great? The prisoners began desecrating and looting the graves. The warden of the prison was requested to make a detailed report of what had happened and what was found 10 years later, and he said that the coffin was cased with lead both within and without, and containing some bones and remains of garments. The lead, in its decayed state, sold for 2 guineas. The bones were thrown about, and the stone coffin broken into pieces. There were also 2 other coffins, and no more found in this part, which were also broke for the sake of the garden in which they lay, broken up and buried as low as the spring. And so it was believed again that the bones of Alfred the Great were lost. In 1840, the jail was demolished. 20-some-odd years later, a man named John Mellor, who described himself as a historian and strolling student, became incredibly interested in the story and saga of King Alfred, which led him to want to know what became of Alfred's bones. He requested, and somehow rather strangely and miraculously received permission from the mayor of Winchester and the lord of the manor to investigate the place where Hyde Abbey had been. Armed with a hand-drawn map that had been made and his eccentric fervor, he began to explore. Mellor found quite a few skeletal remains, and he put them on display for people to see. Among these remains were 5 skulls, one of which he claimed was Alfred the Great. He determined this by using an image from a coin of Alfred that he claimed clearly showed a similarity to one of the skulls he found. To further prove his amazing discovery, he planted fake lead tablets that said they were from the time of Alfred the Great. He was dismissed by many as a charlatan and a quack, but there were some that were very interested and believed that there was indeed some importance to the bones that were found on the land where the old abbey had been. The Reverend of St. Bartholomew's Church right across the street decided to purchase the skeletal remains for Mellor for 10 shillings. Many grand proposals were floated as to what to do with the purchased remains, but because no one really knew whose they were or even what their origin was, they placed them in a brick-lined vault with 2 stone slabs covering it and a ledger stone with a cross and no names. Again, the bones found, purported to have been Alfred the Great, but also widely discredited as nothing, were to sit for another 150 years. Between 1995 and 1999, a community project called The Search for Alfred began, headed by the Winchester Museum Service. An extensive survey was done of the whole site that was once Hyde Abbey. Quite a lot was learned about where the location of the royal tombs could have been, but Alfred remained elusive. After Richard III's bones were found in a parking lot in Leicester, intrigue and interest began again in the bones that were at St. Bartholomew's Church. What if, after all this time, the bones in the unmarked grave were actually Alfred's? A petition was made to the Chancellor of the Diocese of Winchester to open and test the bones in the unmarked grave. On March 25, 2013, with a BBC film crew standing by to document it all, the grave was opened. The remains were removed and stored. Finally, in 2014, the Diocese of Winchester gave permission to test. It was also decided that since carbon dating was going to be done, that the remains that were found during the 1999 excavation should also be looked at. The results of the bones that were in St. Bartholomew's were dated between 1230 and 1500. But a pelvis found in 1999 did come back with dating from the end of the 9th century or possibly the 10th century. Many scientists believe it is quite possible that the pelvis found could be from either Alfred or his son, Edward. And still, the search to find Alfred the Great continues.